What really happened on September 4th, 476? Welcome to Calapex, where giants fall. Today, we embark on an exploration of a major turning point in history, the moment when one of the greatest empires the world has ever known wavered and then fell, September 4th, 476. On that day, in the twilight of an empire that had dominated continents, a last emperor lays down the purple. His name, Romulus, a symbol, almost a twist of fate. For this name is also that of the legendary founder of Rome, between the Romulus of origins and the one at the end, more than 1,000 years of glory, conquests, and triumphs. And on that day, everything collapses. But why? How could such a vast empire fall? And above all, was this fall really the end? But before setting out on a new adventure, think about liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you and bon voyage. At the turn of the 5th century, the Roman Empire finds itself in an unstable situation, marked by the death of Emperor Theodosius III in 395. It is upon his death that a determining division occurs between the two imperial entities, the East, with its capital in Constantinople, and the West, centered on Rome and later Ravenna. This division does not happen overnight, as administrative structures still overlap. However, the emergence of two distinct imperial courts, each with its interests and challenges, gradually accentuates the divergence between these two halves of the empire. The West, under the tutelage of several successive emperors, then faces a series of external threats and internal fragilities that destabilize its already weakened authority. In the early years of the 5th century, pressures from outside intensify. Germanic groups, often called barbarians by the Romans, seek new lands or flee other threats. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, who had already gravitated around the Eastern Roman Empire, decide to turn to Italy. Their arrival culminates with the famous sack of Rome in 410. Although this event is a profound shock to the collective imagination, it is the first time in nearly 8 centuries that the Eternal City falls to foreign enemies. It does not sign the sudden disappearance of the Western Empire. The sack of Rome remains, however, a resounding symbol, revealing the vulnerability of the empire in the face of new actors, pressing it from all sides. Meanwhile, the harsh winter of 406 becomes a decisive turning point. The crossing of the Rhine, a river separating present-day France and Germany, then frozen, allows several peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, to enter en masse into the heart of Roman provinces. This crossing creates a breach in the borders traditionally defended by the legions. Now, Gaul and later Hispania become fields of progressive settlement for these groups that organize into more or less autonomous barbarian kingdoms. Unlike sporadic attacks, these populations intend to settle permanently, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through negotiation with local authorities. The Roman administrative fabric, already strained, is unable to stop their advance, which prepares the progressive fragmentation of these provinces. This rapid transformation of the political landscape partly reflects the internal weaknesses of the Western Empire. During these decades, there is indeed an increase in usurpers who, taking advantage of border insecurity, proclaim themselves emperors to impose themselves locally. A striking example is that of Constantine III, who emerges in Britain and tries to control Gaul. Such rebellions weaken imperial cohesion and plunge the central administration into a chronic crisis of authority. Roman institutions, already severely tested by war and lack of resources, have increasing difficulty maintaining stable order across all the territories under their jurisdiction. Internal rivalries undermine the West's ability to effectively respond to outside dangers. Indeed, the economic crisis is being felt on multiple levels. On the one hand, the the scarcity of currency severely limits the state's ability to collect taxes. Citizens who were once accustomed to fulfilling their fiscal obligations now struggle to do so due to insecurity, declining agricultural yields, and the flight of elites. On the other hand, maintaining the armies becomes an unsolvable challenge. To keep control of the provinces, the empire must recruit more soldiers and pay them regularly, but the coffers are often empty. This situation further weakens imperial influence, as, lacking resources, the power relies on barbarian contingents, supposedly to reinforce the defense, but who actually have their own agendas. As the 5th century progresses, the control exerted by the Western Roman Empire over its provinces gradually recedes. Local administrations, sometimes abandoned by the center, negotiate directly with invaders or attempt to organize autonomously to maintain a semblance of order. In some regions, there is the emergence of local military leaders who primarily seek to protect their immediate communities rather than to serve Rome faithfully. This slow erosion of imperial power is palpable at all levels. Trade routes are no longer as safe as they once were. The supply of food and military equipment becomes unpredictable, while the once prosperous regions of Gaul or Hispania fracture into quasi-independent entities. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, is experiencing a relatively different trajectory. Although the Eastern Court also faces external pressures, most notably from the Huns or the powerful Sassanid Persian Empire, it benefits from a more stable government. Its successive emperors have more well-preserved administrative and military institutions, inherited among others from reforms initiated decades earlier. Each new threat at the eastern borders of the empire is addressed with a coherence and responsiveness that are lacking in the West. The region also retains a denser commercial network, supported by great cities like Antioch or Alexandria, whose wealth contributes to Constantinople's fiscal balance. The upheavals are not limited to Europe. In Asia, various nomadic peoples are moving, helping to reshape the balance of powers, while in Africa, the northern Roman provinces continue their crucial role while maintaining a commercial and cultural link with more distant kingdoms. To better understand this period, let's first examine the situation in Central and Eastern Asia, and then that of the African continent, from the Mediterranean coast to the Sub-Saharan regions. In the Central Asian steppes, the early 5th century is marked by the vast migratory movements of the Huns. These nomads, renowned for their exceptional horsemanship and archery skills, have been gradually approaching the borders of Eastern Europe for several decades. By the end of the 4th century, they had already begun their advance westward, driven by harsh climatic conditions and the need to find new lands for their herds. Their presence, more pressing around 400, increases the pressure on other steppe peoples, who are in turn forced to move, and sometimes to enter Roman or Persian territory. The well-established trails across the Eurasian plains facilitate these migrations and contribute to creating a chain reaction. Each group, displaced by the Huns, finds itself in need of a new residence, potentially in contact with the Western Roman Empire or other political entities such as the Sassanid Persian Empire. Further east, China is then experiencing a phase of division that dominates the entire 5th century. Following the fall of the Jin dynasty in the early 4th century, the country fragmented into several kingdoms, before structuring itself into two major political zones around the year 400, the northern dynasties and the southern dynasties. Among the most significant, the northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Tabgush, a steppe origin people, plays an active role in consolidating power in northern China. In the south, the Song dynasty, founded in 420, begins a reign that, despite internal struggles, manages to relatively preserve a politically coherent space south of the Yangtze River. In the center of this divided Chinese world, Buddhism is making progress. Introduced several centuries earlier through trade routes and contact with India, the Buddhist faith is experiencing considerable growth at the beginning of the 5th century. Monks and scholars traverse Central Asia, carrying sacred texts in various languages, while monasteries flourish in major Chinese capitals. This expansion is accompanied by the translation of numerous Buddhist writings into Chinese, contributing to an unprecedented intellectual flourishing. Political elites, whether from the north or the south, sometimes mobilize Buddhism as a factor of legitimacy or spiritual unification, in a context where the political unity of the country remains fragile. Meanwhile, trade along the Silk Road continues, despite conflicts and divisions. This imposing route, in reality, a network of land and maritime routes, connects China to Western lands by crossing Central Asia. Multiple exchanges enable the circulation of precious goods, Chinese silks, fine stones from the Pamir Mountains, Indian spices, and metals and glassware produced in the Roman sphere. Even though political fragmentation sometimes complicates the security of these routes, a certain continuity persists thanks to oasis cities like Dunhuang or Khotan, which thrive due to the regular passage of caravans. Merchants, whether Sogdian, Persian, or Chinese, skillfully navigate a world with shifting borders, buying and selling high-value goods, while fostering the exchange of various ideas and beliefs. If we now turn to the African continent, its realities from 400 to 425 are closely intertwined with those of the Western Roman Empire. In the north, the African Roman provinces still belong to the imperial domain. The most important ones, such as proconsular, which includes the region of Carthage, or Byzacena, remain under Roman authority until the early 430s. Carthage, initially founded by the Phoenicians long before the Roman era, is a major urban center then, thriving due to its coastal position and fertile hinterland. Since the definitive Roman conquest in the 2nd century before Christ, the city has been integrated into the imperial system and has undergone spectacular architectural renovation. At the beginning of the 5th century, it serves as the hub of Roman presence in the region, while maintaining trade links with Sicily, peninsular Italy, and more distantly with sub-Saharan lands. North Africa plays a strategically crucial role for the Western Roman Empire. It is Italy's breadbasket. Since the time of the empire, the rich cereal lands of present-day Tunisia and eastern Algeria produce considerable quantities of wheat, barley, and olives. The abundant rural villas, often adorned with mosaics and private baths, testify to the economic power of these provincial elites. The wheat exports to Rome or Ravenna, when the imperial capital is transferred to this city in northern Italy, supply the populations and imperial administration while ensuring an essential fiscal resource. Protecting and maintaining the loyalty of these provinces remains a priority for the Western authority, despite the multiplying military and diplomatic challenges. Beyond the coastal zone, the Romans know less precisely the political realities of sub-Saharan Africa. Exchanges occur nonetheless, albeit in reduced and often indirect forms. Caravans periodically cross the Sahara, taking dangerous routes and linking the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa. The rare texts of the time allude to peoples who inhabit the desert margins, often referred to by vague or catch-all names. Archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, tends to show that certain confederations or kingdoms may have been established in fertile Sahelian areas, practicing agriculture and livestock farming. Occasionally, a proto-trade route linking the lands of the Niger to the Nile Valley is mentioned, but Roman sources speak of it only distantly, often through accounts from Egypt. In East Africa, some kingdoms or confederations developed around the Great Lakes or along the coast. The Romans, who had already established contacts with Ethiopia, ancient Axum in previous centuries, had only limited information about these areas. The few Mediterranean merchants who ventured there could trade ivory, spices, and sometimes gold. However, the sources were too sparse to outline a precise and complete panorama. Roman authors, more interested in defending the imperial borders against barbarian pressures, focused little on these distant lands. Nevertheless, it is known that the rise of Axum, a powerful Christian kingdom in the Horn of Africa, continued during this era. Axum controlled a trade network from the Red Sea to the interior, exporting products like incense and myrrh to the east and the west. This African power, with its own monetary system, intrigued Greek and Roman observers who saw Axum as a potentially valuable trade partner, but too distant to consider a military alliance. When Valentinian III ascended to the throne of the Western Roman Empire in 425 Anno Domini, he was only a 6-year-old child. It should be noted that his mother, Gala Placidia, widow of the powerful general Constantius III and daughter of Emperor Theodosius I, assumed the regency until her son was old enough to rule. This political context was already precarious. Multiple internal and external threats weighed on the Western Empire, whose capital had been in Ravenna for several decades. Gala Placidia, a respected figure for her piety and direct connection to the Theodosian dynasty, sought to maintain imperial authority in a Roman world in full transformation. She relied on a complex alliance with senatorial elites, and above all, on the military skills of strong men like General Aetius, one of the few strategists capable of containing the conquering tendencies of so-called barbarian peoples present in Gaul and elsewhere. In the first decade of Valentinian III's reign, the priority of the Western Empire was to stabilize the provinces still under Roman control. The Visigoths, settled in Aquitaine, in the southwest of present-day France, constantly threatened to expand towards the Rhone Valley or even further north. General Aetius, often called the last great Roman in some sources, distinguished himself by his diplomatic abilities and his capacity to mobilize varied contingents, sometimes even composed of federated barbarians, to repel invasions. The Visigoths, led at the time by chiefs like Theodoric I, regularly negotiated treaties with Rome, but continued to encroach on new lands, aware of the growing weakness of the imperial apparatus. In this context, Aetius, supported by Galla Placidia, managed nonetheless to maintain a semblance of order. He used his influence to restore, at least in part, Roman authority in a Gaul fractured by multiple barbarian kingdoms. The years 430, 440 were thus marked by a complex policy of alliances and successive truces, punctuated by sporadic conflicts. Following the regency of Galla Placidia, Valentinian III, having reached adolescence, began to assert his power. However, the figure of General Aetius remained central. He became the true military and political pivot of the Western Empire. Sources from the time, notably some late Latin chronicles, emphasize the constant tension between the emperor and his main war leader, each seeking to maintain the upper hand in an already weakened state. However, until around 450, this difficult collaboration ensured at least relative cohesion in the face of dangers threatening the western frontiers. One of the highlights of this forced cooperation occurred in 451, when Attila, the king of the Huns, launched a vast campaign in Gaul. Faced with this Hunnic threat, Aetius assembled a coalition that included not only Roman troops, but also Visigothic and Burgundian contingents, and other people settled on Gallic territory. It was during the famous Battle of the Catalonian Plains, which took place around June 451 in the region of Chalons, in present-day France, that this coalition managed to block Attila's advance. The event remains crucial for understanding the overall strategy of Valentinian III and Aetius. By achieving a victory, even a relative one, Rome demonstrated that it could still mobilize its barbarian allies to defend its provinces. However, this victory does not resolve the persistent fragility of the Western Empire, which increasingly relies on Germanic or Hunnic troops in the service of Rome. The dependence on barbarian contingents is a fundamental problem. When the empire can no longer properly pay its soldiers or guarantee them land, alliances weaken and can turn against the imperial authority. Thus, all military campaigns, even victorious ones, leave the West in a state of permanent instability. Valentinian III has to cope with this system of federates, these barbarian peoples who officially serve Rome in exchange for status and subsidies, but who do not hesitate to side with their own people whenever there is a conflict of interest. Political maneuvers multiply, and Aetius often establishes himself as the indispensable intermediary to prevent alliances from collapsing. However, this complex network does not guarantee long-term security. It only delays the inevitable weakening of imperial authority, eroded by the diminishing financial and human resources. At the same time, in the middle of the 5th century, another peril becomes clearer: the episode of Attila and the Hunnic threat. Attila, who inherits Hunnic power with his brother Bleda around 434, eventually eliminates the latter to rule alone. The Huns then form a formidable confederation, bringing together several peoples of Asian origin often perceived by the Romans as particularly brutal. After being checked in 451 at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, they quickly turn towards Italy. In 452, Attila crosses the Alps and enters northern Italy, ravaging the surroundings of Aquileia and other cities. For a contemporary audience, it might seem surprising that he does not take Rome, but it is likely that logistical difficulties, diplomatic pressure, some mention the intervention of Pope Leo I, who is said to have met Attila in person, and the epidemics then raging in the region played a role in the Hunnic leader's decision to withdraw. His more or less hasty retreat spares the Eternal City from a new sacking, 42 years after that, by Alaric's Visigoths in 410. The geopolitical consequences of these Hunnic attacks in the Italian peninsula are nevertheless profound. Some Germanic tribes, fearing Attila's power, prefer to negotiate with the Western Roman Empire to obtain protection and stability, thereby confirming the strategic importance of Roman diplomacy. Other, more opportunistic groups take advantage of the weakened regions to plunder them. At Attila's death in 453, the Hunnic Empire quickly disintegrates, undermined by internal struggles and the rebellion of subjugated peoples. The Huns will never again manage to represent such a unified threat in the West. However, this respite does not bring serenity to the Western Roman Empire, which remains confronted with its structural problems. Economically and socially, the period around the mid-5th century is also one of a slow but inexorable transformation of Western Roman society. Italy, politically fragile, increasingly depends on rich provinces like North Africa, hitherto considered Rome's traditional granary. To a lesser extent, some regions of southern Gaul also continue to supply the peninsula with agricultural products and fiscal resources. However, political instability and barbarian incursions into these provinces compromise the security of exchanges and the regularity of supply deliveries. The great senatorial families and the Roman aristocracy, once pillars of the imperial regime, gradually retreat to their rural estates, seeking to isolate themselves from conflict areas. This exodus to the countryside, which has been observed for several decades, intensifies under the reign of Valentinian III. This is the phenomenon of latifundia, these vast estates owned by notables who strive to secure their own interests, sometimes by negotiating directly with local barbarian leaders. Simultaneously, another major development is occurring on the religious and political front, the rise of Christianity, whose ecclesiastical hierarchies gradually take on a leading role in city governance and the organization of relief efforts. By the mid-5th century, Christianity is now the official religion of the empire, and bishops, particularly those of Rome and Ravenna, are increasingly influential in public decisions. They serve as moral and diplomatic intermediaries, trying to protect the civilian population from the depredations of soldiers and raiders. Large cities, especially Rome, concentrate an influential clergy that can intervene with generals or barbarian kings to negotiate the sparing of churches and the faithful. The influence of Ravenna, the capital of the Western Empire, is felt in religious matters. The imperial court, under the guidance of Gala, Placidia, and then Valentinian III, is theoretically the guarantor of Christian orthodoxy in its sphere of influence. However, this rise of episcopal authority alone cannot compensate for the structural weakness of imperial power. The role of Valentinian III himself is often questioned. Considered impressionable, he is accused by some contemporaries of giving too much latitude to General Aetius and not knowing how to manage the rivalries that shake the court. Ultimately, the imbalance between military authorities and imperial power fuels new internal conflicts. The takeover of North Africa by the Vandals between 430 and 440 represents a major turning point in late antiquity. At the time, the Western Roman Empire is already weakened by internal crises and the pressure of multiple barbarian peoples. But North Africa remains one of its main assets, thanks to its agricultural wealth and the prosperity of cities like Carthage. The settlement of the Vandals in this region, under their king Gaiseric, will upset the economic and political balance of the entire West. In this section, we will first examine the genesis of the Vandal presence in Africa, then analyze the impact of this event on the stability of the Western Roman Empire. To understand how the Vandals reached North Africa, we must go back a few years, to the beginning of the 5th century. Originating from Central or Eastern Europe, the Vandals were pushed westward by the pressure of other peoples, notably the Huns. Like many barbarian groups, they entered the Western Roman Empire amidst military and political turmoil. A crucial step in their migrations occurred in 406, when they crossed the frozen Rhine in the company of the Alans and the Sueves, thus penetrating into the Western Roman provinces. Over the years, these groups moved south, crossing Gaul before reaching the Iberian Peninsula. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Vandals first settled in several regions, including Baetica, in the south of present-day Spain. However, their coexistence with other peoples present, as well as with local Roman authorities, proved difficult. Rivalries erupted, and conflicts over the best lands gradually ruined the fragile balance. At the same time, the Visigoth threat, encouraged by Rome to contain other peoples, became more apparent. The Visigoths, military allies of the empire, were sometimes sent to repress or relocate Vandal factions deemed uncontrollable. It is in this context that the figure of Gaiseric emerges, who becomes king of the Vandals around 428. He inherits a complex situation in Spain, marked by frequent clashes. Gaiseric quickly understands that the Iberian Peninsula offers little in the way of a stable future, particularly faced with the growing pressure from Rome, relayed by the Visigoths. He devises an ambitious plan to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and reach North Africa, an imperial province reputed for its fertility and relative stability. Around 429, Gaiseric and his Vandals begin the crossing. The exact numbers are difficult to estimate, but several tens of thousands of people are mentioned: warriors, women, children, and allies, sometimes drawn from other ethnic groups. Their arrival in Africa takes place in a climate of surprise for the local Roman garrisons. Ancient historians report that the Count of Africa, supposed to defend the region, struggles to muster enough forces to block the Vandal invasion. Moreover, the empire has other military priorities at the time. It must counter the Visigoths, or keep an eye on Italy in face of various threats. Once settled, the Vandals of Gaiseric quickly progressed into the hinterland. They exploited the internal dissensions of the Western Roman Empire, as well as the weariness of local populations, sometimes exhausted by what they considered an overly burdensome imperial taxation. By allying with certain elites or promising a form of security, Gaiseric managed to consolidate his positions and strengthen his army. Although the confrontations were numerous, the Vandals gradually ensured control over several strategic cities and regions. The coup de grace came in 439, when Gaiseric seized Carthage, the capital of the African province. Carthage, founded by the Phoenicians several centuries before Christ, was not only a vital commercial crossroads, but also a symbol of Roman power in Africa. Since the time of the great rivalry between Rome and Carthage, in the context of the Punic Wars, this city has always held a crucial place for the empire in economic, diplomatic, and cultural domains. Its fall into the hands of the Vandals was therefore a significant shock to the Roman power. Beyond the symbolic loss represented by the capture of Carthage, the material consequences were enormous. The lands of North Africa had long been the breadbasket of the West. Rome and Italy, in particular, heavily depended on grain shipments from Carthage and the surrounding regions. With the Vandal conquest, this source of supply became uncertain, and the empire was forced to negotiate export conditions to continue feeding its urban population. The capture of Carthage in 439 marked an irreversible turning point in the Western Roman Empire's ability to maintain its authority. Initially, one might have expected a massive military reaction from the emperor to repel the Vandals. However, the empire's internal difficulties were manifold: recurrent political crises, lack of financial resources, and reliable soldiers, power struggles between generals and ephemeral emperors. Attempts to reconquer Africa clashed with Gaiseric's tactical ingenuity and the determined will of his men to retain what they had acquired. In the absence of a strong enough Western army to counter the Vandals' progression, Rome had to contend with the new power in place. Talks were initiated, sometimes leading to ephemeral treaties. The idea was to guarantee a minimum of security for Roman ships wishing to transport grain or to secure the release of prisoners captured during the Vandal raids. But these negotiations, largely to Gaiseric's advantage, confirmed the diplomatic and military weakening of the Western Empire. Gaiseric did not limit himself to ruling over North Africa. He understood the importance of the Mediterranean as a commercial route and as a means of exerting pressure on the entire Roman world. Under his impetus, the Vandal fleet developed considerably, to the point of becoming a formidable naval force. Raids were carried out against several Mediterranean islands, and the coasts of the Italian peninsula were not spared. The Vandals, now masters of Carthage, could launch quick and devastating maritime expeditions, targeting notably Sicily and Sardinia, once under Roman control. The most famous and undoubtedly the most significant raid occurred in 455. That year, the Vandals managed to land near Rome and plunder it. The event left a strong imprint on the collective imagination. Although the city had already been sacked in 410 by Alaric's Visigoths, the Vandal incursion provoked a new trauma, reinforced by the resonance of the word vandalism in later European culture. Sources from the time, though imperfect, agree that treasures accumulated over centuries were either taken away or destroyed. Moreover, beyond the symbol, this vengeful sack demonstrated how much the empire's power had diminished. The Roman authorities, overwhelmed, could not prevent these repeated incursions, which resulted in the pillaging of the historic capital. Several peoples of Germanic origin, such as the Visigoths and the Burgundians, as well as the Suebi, settled in the Western Roman Empire. The Visigoths, originally located in the Balkans from where they had migrated westward, were granted the status of foederati in Aquitaine by the Roman Empire at the beginning of the 5th century, as a reward for their military support. Their leader, Wallia, obtained permission in the years 410 to 420 to settle in the region of Toulouse. These initial agreements established an embryonic Visigothic kingdom under the theoretical control of the empire. However, after a few decades of relative cooperation between the Roman authorities and the Visigoths, the latter's position strengthened. In the first half of the 5th century, they expanded their influence not only in Aquitaine, but also further south, reaching the Garonne Valley. By around 450, they enjoyed growing autonomy. They could no longer be considered a mere auxiliary of Rome. The Visigothic kingdom then asserted itself as a regional power, sometimes negotiating on equal terms with the empire. Simultaneously, the Burgundians, another Germanic people, gradually settled in the Middle Rhone Valley, in what is now eastern France. They reinforced their settlement through successive treaties with the Roman authorities, granting them land in exchange for military service and some protection of the Gallic territory against other hostile groups. This geographical positioning, at the heart of the communication routes linking Italy to northern Gaul, granted the Burgundians a strategic role. They often acted as intermediaries between the imperial authority, trying to maintain a semblance of control, and the local populations who sought relative stability. Aware of their importance, the Burgundian kings developed marital and diplomatic policies with other Germanic peoples and with Gallo-Roman notables to ensure lasting integration. In the north of Gaul, the Frankish people were divided into several factions, but they all shared a Germanic origin. By the end of the 4th century, some Frankish groups had already been settled as foederati in areas of future Belgium, notably to protect the Rhine borders. From the mid-5th century, the Frankish expansion strengthened, taking advantage of the growing weakness of the Western Roman Empire. The area corresponding to the Belgian plain and northeastern Gaul, traditionally under the guard of the Roman army, proved increasingly difficult to defend. Several Frankish leaders imposed themselves locally, while sometimes displaying nominal allegiance to Rome. Gradually, the Franks extended their control and took root more permanently beyond the initially set boundaries, thus preparing the future formation of a Frankish kingdom, which, in the long term, would become a major player in medieval Western Europe. Hispania, present-day Spain, represented another space of significant fragmentation. Since 409, several peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, settled in Hispania after crossing the Rhine. While the Vandals and Alans eventually crossed this region to move further into North Africa in the early 430s, The Suebi remained in the northwest of the peninsula in what is now Galicia. By the mid-5th century, there was thus a complex coexistence between the Suebi, permanently settled in the northwestern part, the Visigoths who intervened occasionally in Hispania to consolidate their positions, and some remnants of the Roman administration that still survived in a few provinces, notably around Tarraconensis, in the northeast of the peninsula. Alliances and hostilities fluctuated according to opportunities, and the Roman authority was most often reduced to weak garrisons, unable to restore effective control over the entire region. The rise to the throne of Avitus perfectly illustrates the uncertainties of this era. Born towards the end of the 4th century into an influential Gallo-Roman family, Avitus briefly became the Western emperor after the death of Emperor Petronius Maximus in 455. Supported notably by the Visigoths, whose presence and alliances in Gaul he had encouraged, he sought to consolidate his position by relying on the Gallo-Roman aristocracy and the military support of certain federated troops. However, his reign was short-lived. Avitus faced hostility from other factions within the Roman aristocracy in Italy, particularly from the powerful general Ricimer. By the summer of 456, the empire was confronted with increasing financial and military difficulties. Avitus, failing to curb the crisis, lost the essential support of the forces on which he relied. Quickly overwhelmed, he was deposed the same year and died shortly thereafter in obscure circumstances. Some talk of a forced exile where he was compelled to become a bishop, others of death in battle. After the ousting of Avitus, the imperial vacancy lasted several months until Majorian ascended to the throne in 457. Majorian, from the Italian senatorial nobility, was considered a competent officer, supported by Ricimer, the real strongman of the Western Roman army. Unlike some previous emperors, Majorian showed reformist energy. He sought to restore the finances of the empire, reorganize the administration, and strengthen the army to reclaim provinces lost under barbarian control. He led several campaigns attempting to restore Roman authority, notably in Gaul. He achieved some local successes, fought certain barbarian kingdoms, and tried to rebuild a fleet with the aim of reconquering North Africa, which had been lost to the Vandals. Many sources highlight Majorian's courage and tenacity. He appears as one of the last Western Roman emperors to undertake a genuine effort at reconquest. However, his ambitious plans clashed with the interests of Ricimer and other notables, who feared seeing their prerogatives diminished. After military and diplomatic setbacks, Majorian found himself politically isolated. In 461, as he returned from a difficult campaign, Ricimer orchestrated his deposition and subsequent execution. Majorian's fate symbolizes the empire's inability to undertake profound reform. Even a motivated and competent sovereign could not overcome court intrigues and resource shortages. Following Majorian's death, Ricimer imposed a new emperor, Libius Severus, whose chief quality seemed to be his complete submission to the general's will. Sources from the time describe Libius Severus as an emperor lacking political stature and devoid of any independent military or diplomatic foundation. Ricimer of semi-barbarian origin, his mother reportedly Roman, his father Suevic or Gothic, remained the de facto master, controlling the armies and appointments to high offices. Libius Severus's reign exemplified the ongoing Roman decay. He was unable to maintain order in the provinces, where barbarian kingdoms strengthened their positions. His authority increasingly limited itself to Italy, and even there, with great difficulty in raising taxes and paying the troops. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, was reluctant to fully recognize Libius Severus, viewing his enthronement as a coup by Ricimer. This resulted in diplomatic isolation that worsened the situation. In 465, the death, or assassination according to some accounts, of Libius Severus left the Western imperial throne vacant once more. Ricimer faced a challenge. He had to legitimize a new emperor acceptable to the Eastern Empire while preserving his own power in Italy. It was in this context that other ephemeral rulers emerged after 465, perpetuating political instability and further hastening the fragmentation of what remained of the Western Roman Empire. When Anthemius ascended to the throne in 467, it was thanks to the backing of Leo I, the Eastern Emperor, who wished to strengthen the Western position. Anthemius, himself from an influential Constantinople family and likely married to an imperial princess, endeavored to restore a semblance of order in the provinces still under Roman control. He settled in Rome, but remained dependent on the powerful general Ricimer, the true kingmaker in Italy. Ricimer, of Slavic or Gothic origin according to sources, never claimed the throne for himself. As a barbarian, he knows it would be difficult for him to be recognized by the old Roman aristocracy. But he controls the Italian army and decides the fate of emperors behind the scenes. He hopes that Anthemius, supported by the East, will be able to repel the threats multiplying at the borders, notably that of the Visigoths in Gaul or that of the Vandals in North Africa. The latter, led by their king Gaiseric, harassed the Italian coasts and compromised the wheat supply of the peninsula. However, the relationship between Ricimer and Anthemius quickly deteriorates. The general believes that the emperor is not responding effectively to military emergencies and is too independent of the military apparatus. At the beginning of 472, after several months of disagreement, Ricimer breaks with Anthemius. It is the beginning of an open conflict. Rome undergoes a siege, the population is caught in a stranglehold, and Anthemius tries in vain to rally the senatorial nobility. Finally, in July 472, Anthemius is captured and executed on Ricimer's orders. The empire then falls into chaos and soon acquires a new emperor. Olybrius, a Roman senator supported by the Vandal king Gaiseric, immediately succeeds Anthemius in 472. His reign remains extremely brief. Olybrius settles in Rome, but Ricimer suddenly dies the same year. With the disappearance of this strongman, new rivalries emerge among the military leaders in Italy, notably Gundobad, Ricimer's nephew. Amidst this entanglement, Olybrius struggles to govern and dies himself before the end of 472 under unclear circumstances. Instability worsens. Each emperor holds power for only a few months, while the Italian army remains in the hands of Germanic generals who impose their rule. In 473, Gaiseric is chosen to succeed Olybrius, likely under the influence of Gundobad. The situation improves little. Gaiseric is not recognized by the Eastern Empire. He must manage, like so many others before him, invasions and the shortage of resources in Italy. Historians are sometimes harsh with Gaiseric, highlighting his lack of legitimacy and international support. Despite everything, his reign lasts more than a year, a feat in such troubled times. In 474, Julius Nepos, the new representative of the Eastern Roman Empire for the West, lands in Italy. He forces Gaiseric to abdicate without real resistance, later relegating him to an ecclesiastical position. Julius Nepos, recognized by Constantinople as the legitimate sovereign, becomes the emperor of the West. His hope is to finally consolidate the situation in Italy and repel hostile forces at its border. Yet, he quickly encounters the same problems as his predecessors: empty coffers, military power held by independent Germanic commanders, diplomatic pressures from Gaiseric in North Africa, and, above all, the growing influence of a man who will soon change the face of the empire, Orestes. Orestes, a central figure at the Italian court from the 470s, is not an unknown to his contemporaries. Originally from Pannonia, a region that would today correspond to part of Hungary and Austria, he served as secretary to the famous Hun king, Attila, in the years 440-450. At Attila's death and the collapse of the Hunnic Empire, Orestes returns to the Roman orbit and enters the service of the Western Empire. Endowed with solid diplomatic experience, he wins the trust of several generals and gains great influence over the troops, composed mainly of Germanic mercenaries. When Julius Nepos takes power in 474, he appoints Orestes Magister Militum, that is, Supreme Commander of the Western Army. In fact, this appointment significantly strengthens the position of the Pannonian. He now commands the legions stationed in Italy and exercises effective control over the military administration. Julius Nepos, for his part, remains dependent on the Eastern Empire, which provides him moral support, but is not in a position to send massive troops to defend the West. Very quickly, tension rises between the emperor and his Magister Militum. During the summer of 475, Orestes organized a coup d'état. Chroniclers emphasize that he mobilized both his connections with the war chiefs of the army and his political experience inherited from his time at Attila's court. Orestes' motivations were multiple. Perhaps he believed that Julius Nepos was not acting firmly enough to restore order, or perhaps he aspired to become the true master of Italy. In any case, he forced Julius Nepos to flee to Dalmatia, a region located on the eastern coast of the Adriatic, corresponding to present-day Croatia. Having removed the sitting emperor, Orestes was now undisputed in his military power, but he still needed to install a new emperor to preserve the illusion of Roman institutional continuity. On October 31st, 475, he chose his own son, Romulus Augustulus, to don the imperial purple. This was a highly symbolic and, to a certain extent, cynical decision. It rooted the legitimacy of his coup within his own family, and ensured that he could govern the affairs of Italy without being contradicted by a too independent sovereign. Romulus, an adolescent without real command experience, barely served as a front. By the end of 475, Italy was officially ruled by a very young emperor of 14 years, while the true holder of power was named Orestes. From Ravenna, the imperial capital for several decades, Orestes sought to stabilize the peninsula, at least to secure his own control. His intentions, however, were severely compromised by the realities of the time. All the western provinces had been progressively lost or emancipated from Roman control: Gaul, Hispania, North Africa. It was extremely difficult to collect taxes and gather enough resources to support the army. At the end of the 5th century, the Western army was composed mainly of barbarian mercenaries from various Germanic tribes, Heruli, Rugi, Gepids, sometimes Goths, who fought for Rome in exchange for pay and land prospects. Thus, Orestes' regime faced the crucial issue of paying these troops. The state's coffers were nearly empty, and the province of North Africa, once called the breadbasket of Rome, had been under Vandal domination since the capture of Carthage in 439. Supplying the Italian peninsula was complicated. Furthermore, the federated soldiers had long been demanding land grants in Italy, which would allow them to settle their families and secure a future in compensation for sometimes uncertain pay. But a massive distribution of land to these federates would undoubtedly provoke the ire of the Italian land-owning aristocracy, already very hostile to barbarian interference. Orestes, aware of this fragile balance, tried not to alienate the senators and landowners. However, discontent among the troops simmered, and rumors of a rebellion grew. Moreover, the people of Italy, exhausted by years of conflict, instability, and economic crisis, no longer harbored great illusions about Rome's promises. The inhabitants of the cities feared the plundering by undisciplined troops and the abuses of armed bands. The rural population already suffered under the weight of the latifundia, these vast agricultural estates controlled by a few senatorial families who imposed their own rules. In daily life, survival took precedence over the idea of imperial loyalty. Romulus Augustulus, the adolescent imposed by his father as emperor, was not truly consulted. Sources sometimes describe him as a mere pawn placed on the throne to ensure that the appearance of a unified empire persisted. He neither had the military aura necessary to command the troops, nor the diplomatic experience that could reassure the elites. In later accounts, ancient and medieval authors would mock this young sovereign by dubbing him Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, as his imperial status seemed limited. His name, Romulus, painfully evoked the glorious history of the Eternal City, allegedly founded by Romulus and Remus, whereas his destiny would precipitate the end of an empire several centuries old. During the summer of 476, Roman Italy finds itself in a precarious situation. The so-called federated troops, mostly composed of soldiers of Germanic origin, demand that the previous promises of the imperial power be finally kept. At the time, these men were not traditional Roman legionnaires. They were barbaric fighters that the Western Empire had incorporated into its army, often to make up for the lack of regular troops. In exchange for their services, the federates were used to receiving land or regular wages. But in 476, the state coffers are almost empty, and the redistribution of land faces the hostility of the Italian landed aristocracy. This class of wealthy landowners, keen on preserving their estates, considers that surrendering the best parcels of the peninsula would mean losing a part of their power and influence. Tensions rise as the army, essential for maintaining a semblance of order in the Western Empire, feels aggrieved and neglected. Orestes knows that to maintain the fragile balance upon which the empire rests, he must accommodate the Roman elites. These elites, who control the large rural estates, form the base of the local economic system and ensure, to some extent, the supply of the cities. They also enjoy considerable prestige within society. Fulfilling the pressing demands of the federates, providing them with land and settling their overdue pay, would require confiscating large landed estates, which would lead to a direct conflict with the aristocracy. Orestes, therefore, wonders how to satisfy troops whose loyalty conditions his immediate survival without alienating the elite that, in the long term, ensures the stability of Italy. As the weeks pass by, the repeated demands of the soldiers become more insistent. The federated officers, who have made pacts with Rome to obtain rank and advantages, find themselves humiliated by Orestes' inability to honor their part of the contract. Frustration spreads in the military camps. Desertions are noted, and the men's loyalty to their command wanes. In this explosive context, a new leader emerges, gathering around him a growing number of disenchanted warriors, Odoacer. His precise origin remains a subject of debate among modern historians. Some say he was a Herulian, others a Rugian, Germanic tribes originating from Central Europe. At the time, the fact that he was himself a barbarian of obscure ancestry did not prevent Odoacer from being respected by his peers. On the contrary, His bravery in battle and his knack for negotiation make him a charismatic figure capable of uniting disparate contingents. Odoacer's role quickly grows during the summer negotiations. Several Germanic chiefs, tired of the hesitations of Orestes' government, see him as a more determined leader. Odoacer does not yet have an official authority conferred by the Senate, nor a position comparable to that of a traditional Roman general. But he enjoys a considerable advantage, the massive support of the military base, which, on the ground, holds the weapons and the power. Faced with Orestes' intransigence, who cannot or will not respond to the troops' demands, Odoacer presents himself as the alternative. He promises more equitable land distributions, even if this promise sometimes remains vague. He also suggests that under his leadership, Italy could regain a semblance of peace, free of Byzantine intrigues and internal quarrels that have plagued the empire for decades. During the summer of 476, confrontation seems increasingly inevitable. The soldiers want to be paid, or at least obtain the guarantee of a plot of land to sustain themselves. Orestes, aware of the danger, still tries to negotiate. He searches for formulas to defer expulsions, perhaps hoping to convince some aristocrats to yield a fraction of their less fertile lands. But the federates expect something else. They want real assurances that their status will be recognized. Therefore, in a continuous tension, the different factions arm and organize themselves. Odoacer travels across northern Italy, forging alliances with barbarian groups long established in the region, as well as with officers exasperated by Orestes' hesitant policy. Towards the end of August, events accelerate. Each camp understands that negotiating further will only prolong instability, harmful to all. The breaking point occurs near Pavia, in Lombardy. At the time, this city played a strategic role as a fortified place and commercial crossroads. Orestes stationed part of his forces there, hoping to contain Odoacer far from Ravenna, the imperial capital. However, the sources of the time remain unclear about the exact course of the battles. Some Byzantine authors, like Marcellinus Combes, mention a real battle, while others suggest rather a skirmish with a quick outcome. In any case, the result is clear. Orestes is defeated. The date generally put forward by chroniclers is August 28, 476. His army, poorly coordinated and unmotivated, cannot withstand the offensive led by Odoacer and his supporters. Orestes likely tries to flee or regroup elsewhere, but he is captured and executed. This execution is a significant act, as it shatters the shadow power that Orestes had exercised for more than a year. In the wake of this, Orestes' brother, Paul, also finds himself caught up in the gears of repression. The accounts do not always indicate whether he is captured or killed in combat, but it is clear that he does not withstand the wave of hostility that falls upon Orestes' close associates for long. Under this violent pressure, the circle of loyal supporters who surrounded the former secretary of Attila disintegrates. Some flee hastily, others are killed or forced to submit to Odoacer. For many, the fall of Orestes is not a surprise. They realize that power in Italy has shifted, and that anyone who continues to support the old regime risks confiscation of their property, exile, or worse. What about the resistance in Ravenna? This city, which became the imperial capital under the reign of Honorius at the beginning of the 5th century, is equipped with natural fortifications thanks to its surrounding marshes. Yet, in that tumultuous summer of 476, these protections have little opportunity to be tested. The troops of Orestes, no longer having unified command, are unable to organize a solid defense. The Roman officers still stationed in the city worry about Odoacer's willingness to enter without encountering major obstacles. Furthermore, many local notables, senators, bishops, administrators, consider making terms with the new master of Italy rather than engaging in a lost cause. In their eyes, the fall of Orestes is a fait accompli, and it is better to adapt quickly to limit destruction. September 4th, 476, is generally considered by historians as a pivotal day in the history of the Western Roman Empire, when Odoacer finally enters Ravenna. Many chroniclers question the violence of this intrusion, but available testimonies indicate that it was relatively peaceful. The gates of the city, already strained by shortages, open almost without a fight. The Senate, whose prestige has eroded over the decades, realizes its impotence in the face of a superior military force. Aware that they could spare many lives by negotiating, the senators decide to welcome Odoacer without resorting to arms. The inhabitants, for the most part, approve of this solution, meant to preserve order and limit destruction. This apparent tranquility is also due to the weariness generated by previous political troubles. Civil wars, rivalries between generals, and economic difficulties have undermined the people's trust in traditional institutions. Odoacer, even perceived as an invader, promises relative short-term stability. In the eyes of many citizens, the arrival of these barbarian troops can avoid another massacre. Thus, while a bloody battle was feared, the capture of Ravenna occurs in an almost unexpectedly moderate climate. As Odoacer solidifies his grip on the city, a crucial question arises: what to do with Emperor Romulus Augustulus? About 16 years old, he bears a highly symbolic name. Romulus refers to the legendary founder of Rome, while Augustulus is a diminutive of Augustus, suggesting the idea of an emperor weakened compared to his glorious predecessors. In reality, he is perceived as a mere puppet controlled by his father, Orestes. When summoned to the audience hall, he advances in imperial attire, but appears fearful and reserved. Odoacer, aware of the moment's importance, asks him to formally renounce all imperial power. According to rare accounts from the period, Romulus Augustulus offers no resistance. Under the threatening gaze of the soldiers and faced with Odoacer's authority, the adolescent submits. The imperial insignia, particularly the diadem and the purple, are removed from him. This symbolic gesture profoundly impacts the minds of observers. The purple, once associated with imperial prestige, now falls into the hands of a military leader of barbarian origin. To emphasize the finality of this act, Odoacer immediately sends these insignia to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. According to several witnesses, this marks the official end of the independent Western Empire. Henceforth, there remains only one Roman emperor, established in Constantinople. At the time, many expected Odoacer to eliminate Romulus Augustulus to prevent any potential plot. However, the new ruler of Italy adopts a more lenient approach. He spares the ex-emperor and allows him to settle far from court intrigues. According to some sources, notably the historian Jordanes, the young Romulus was granted an allowance and found refuge at the Castellum Lucullanum, near Naples. This site, once fortified, becomes a haven where one imagines the adolescent leading a discreet life, far removed from power struggles. Later documents mention his name less and less until he almost completely fades into oblivion. This leniency contrasts with the treatment inflicted on Orestes, Romulus's father, who does not enjoy such reprieve. On the contrary, Odoacer, in his desire to consolidate his authority, shows firmness towards those who supported the former regime. Romulus, seen as a puppet without real responsibilities, arouses less resentment. For the Roman population, this clemency is a strong signal. Odoacer does not aim to erase Roman civilization with one stroke, but seeks to establish lasting peace. By sparing the last emperor of the West, he cultivates the image of a leader willing to negotiate with the local elite. When Romulus Augustulus is deposed, most of the troops stationed in Italy, mainly composed of soldiers of barbarian origin, recognize Odoacer as their new leader. However, he does not claim the title of emperor. This choice is significant. Officially taking on the imperial purple would have constituted a clear break with the Eastern Empire, the last bastion of Roman imperial authority under Emperor Zeno's governance. Odoacer therefore opts to be called Rex Italiae, meaning King of Italy, a title he adopts in front of the army and the Senate. This prestigious assembly, whose history dates back to the early Republican Rome. The Roman Senate, established in Italy and traditionally reluctant to welcome new figures at the state's helm, nonetheless approves this new king. This approval is not merely an opportunistic gesture. The senators, weary from decades of civil strife and changes in emperors, see it as an opportunity to stabilize Italy and preserve as much as possible their former privileges. Indeed, a conciliatory Senate stands a better chance of negotiating the defense of its interests under the new regime than by contesting an authority backed by formidable armed contingents. Another essential aspect of this proclamation concerns the question of legitimacy. To avoid appearing as a complete usurper in the eyes of the Roman world, Odoacer argues that he acts with the implicit approval of the Eastern Emperor. Even if Zeno from Constantinople has not sent a clear message of support, Odoacer intends to show that his power is not anti-Roman, but aligns with the imperial tradition's continuity. It is this political subtlety that leads him to present himself as a sovereign, respectful of the Roman order, while remaining perfectly aware that, in reality, his power rests on the strength and loyalty of his soldiers. Despite his Germanic origins, Odoacer seeks to accommodate the Roman population of Italy, numerous and attached to its administrative and legal traditions. He therefore decides to retain a large part of the Roman civil officials in place, from notaries to local governors, to preserve the mechanisms of the state and ensure tax collection. This Roman continuity, despite the absence of a Western emperor, provides an unprecedented form of stability after years of crises and incessant rivalries in imperial power. However, Odoacer must also reward the men who brought him to power, particularly the armed groups and their leaders. The issue of land distribution becomes central, as these soldiers, federated or not, have long demanded a reward for their services. One option is to grant barbarian warriors plots of land taken from the estates of wealthy Italian landowners. This potential expropriation causes concern among the land-owning aristocracy, but Odoacer generally ensures not to completely ruin the local elites. He thus seeks a balance. He distributes enough properties to maintain the loyalty of his troops while trying to keep the relative support of the Senate. This equilibrium remains precarious, however, as satisfying the soldiers is crucial for the regime's survival, while the support, or at least the neutrality, of the Roman aristocracy remains necessary to ensure the administration and economy function smoothly. Moreover, the religious question holds significant importance in Italy at the end of the 5th century. Odoacer is an Arian Christian, a doctrine adopted by many barbarians since the 4th century. Arianism acknowledges the divine nature of Jesus Christ, but considers the Son subordinate to the Father, a position deemed heretical by the Catholic Church, coming out of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Yet, the vast majority of the Italian population, and especially the clergy, identify with Nicene Catholicism. To avoid significant tensions already seen elsewhere in the empire, when a religious group imposes its dominance, Odoacer adopts a policy of relative tolerance. He does not impede the practice of the Catholic faith and does not persecute Italian bishops. Similarly, he generally allows ecclesiastical institutions to retain their privileges and traditional roles, merely exercising oversight on appointments to high religious positions, insofar as these might affect the political balance. This approach allows the barbarian king to secure the local clergy's support, or at least its benevolent neutrality, and to limit sectarian conflicts. All these internal organizational measures are undertaken while Odoacer remains, out of diplomatic necessity, oriented toward the Eastern Empire. The sovereign reigning from Constantinople during this period is Emperor Zeno. Zeno observes the Italian situation with a certain caution. On one hand, he does not wish to immediately legitimize a barbarian leader who has deposed an emperor, even if the latter, Romulus Augustulus, no longer had widespread support. On the other hand, he lacks the military resources to conduct a large-scale expedition against Odoacer and impose his own candidate in the west. Instead, Zeno adopts a position of waiting and calculation. He leaves in doubt the legitimacy he might eventually grant to Odoacer. In a correspondence mentioned by some chroniclers, although direct sources are fragmentary, the Eastern Emperor is said to have recognized Odoacer as patrician, that is, a high dignitary of the empire, tasked with administering Italy on behalf of the emperor in Constantinople. In theory, this title restricts Odoacer to the status of an imperial representative, but in reality, it is he who exercises full civil and military power on Italian soil. Thus, even if Odoacer can boast of Zeno's agreement to legitimize his authority, the Eastern Emperor merely tolerates this unprecedented situation while preserving the notion of a single imperial sovereignty, now exclusively based in Constantinople. The diplomatic ambiguity is further complicated by the claim of another figure, Julius Nepos. Deposed in 475, Julius Nepos is forced to flee to Dalmatia, a region corresponding today to part of Croatia and the coastal Balkans. However, he still declares himself the legitimate emperor of the West, believing he was unjustly ousted by a previous usurper, Emperor Gaiseric, and having received, at the time, official recognition from the Eastern Emperor. Thus, the presence of Julius Nepos in Dalmatia, very close to the Italian peninsula, creates a unique diplomatic situation. For Zeno, there still exists, formally, a Western Roman emperor in exile, whom the Eastern Empire can acknowledge in words as long as he does not threaten its own stability. For Odoacer, Julius Nepos remains a potential rival who could, given the opportunity, seek help from Zeno, or attempt to rally discontented troops. However, the opposition between Odoacer and Julius Nepos does not immediately result in open war, as Dalmatia lacks the military power to invade Italy, and Odoacer is not sufficiently secure in his position to embark on a significant expedition beyond the Adriatic. Initially, Odoacer manages to maintain peace in the heart of Italy, but Odoacer soon has to deal with external pressures. To the northeast of the peninsula, the Rugians, a Germanic people settled in the Danube region, pose a potential threat. Odoacer regularly conducts campaigns to try to repel their incursions or stabilize the frontier line. His efforts at expansion or securing the northeast are also aimed at asserting his authority over other territories that, until then, had escaped direct Roman control or only recognized his power in uncertain ways. However, Odoacer's rise in power is not viewed favorably by the Eastern Emperor Zeno. Although Zeno is unable to intervene in the early years, mistrust sets in. Tensions crystallize when Odoacer attempts to seize regions traditionally under the imperial sphere, like Dalmatia, where the ex-emperor Julius Nepos had sought refuge. Moreover, the disappearance of Nepos in 480 leaves the field open for Odoacer to claim stronger legitimacy. The breaking point occurs in the early 490s. Emperor Zeno, in conflict with Odoacer, then encourages the powerful Ostrogoth king Theodoric to invade Italy. The Ostrogoths, formidable warriors, have a solid reputation from their battles with the Huns. In 493, Theodoric's troops cross into the peninsula and embark on the conquest of Italy. After several battles, Odoacer is defeated and eventually captured. According to later chronicles, he is executed on March 15, 493, sealing the end of his reign. This episode marks the start of a new Ostrogothic dynasty in the region, under the authority of Theodoric, who in turn attempts to preserve the Roman administrative tradition while consolidating a Germanic kingdom. On a social level, the impact of the end of the imperial title in the West remains uneven. The Roman elites are already accustomed to alliances with barbarian generals or kings holding strategic positions. They often chose to adapt to the new situation, protecting their land holdings and preserving their status as notables as much as possible. In Odoacer's government, the administration, Roman law, and the organization of the old cities function without major upheaval. However, urban populations bear the economic consequences of declining trade and the dwindling supply of currency, a process that began before 476, but intensified when connections with certain provinces were severed. The gradual fusion between barbarians and Romans, often driven by necessity rather than coercion, is also observed in civil society. Mixed marriages occur, sealing agreements between Germanic and Gallic Roman or Italo-Roman families. Christian notables, whether Catholic or Arian, start to coexist in forms of religious compromise, offering a space for dialogue through the local church. Bishops, very influential in the West, also negotiate with the new power to protect their authority and their faithful. The dating of 476 as the fall of the Western Roman Empire is part of a long historiographical debate. Other moments have sometimes been proposed, such as 410, sack of Rome by the Visigoths, 455, second sack of Rome by the Vandals, or even 472, when an internal conflict in Rome severely weakened the imperial presence. Each of these dates shows a step in the gradual weakening of central power. Historians have been debating for centuries to determine if there is a key moment that seals the end of the empire. What is certain is that for the contemporaries of the events, the sensation of a gradual decay was already palpable since at least the beginning of the 5th century. The invasions, fiscal erosion, multiplication of barbarian kingdoms, and drastic reduction of imperial authority in the West slowly transformed the political map. In this sense, 476 had nothing of an overnight shift felt by the inhabitants. For many, it was a continuity against a backdrop of great transition. The focus on the year 476 is therefore largely a retrospective view, forged by later chroniclers and especially by historians of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Ancient sources do mention the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, but do not systematically present it as a seismic event. They note the sending of the imperial insignia to Constantinople, a highly symbolic gesture for historiography, which proves to be less shocking for contemporaries. In the 16th century, Renaissance humanists sought to classify and organize the past to better define the boundaries between antiquity, the Middle Ages, and their own era. It is in this context that they rediscovered and instrumentalized the date of 476. According to their reading, the end of the Western Emperor marked the emergence of a new era, distinct from classical Roman civilization. This way of segmenting history was later adopted by most European historians, serving as a practical landmark for teaching the so-called medieval period. The Renaissance contributed to the idealization of antiquity as a golden age. Consequently, it was tempting to find the precise moment when this supposedly perfect world had disappeared. The eviction of Romulus Augustulus brought together all the symbolic ingredients. A young ruler bearing the name of Rome's mythical founder, deposed by a barbarian leader, and then the disappearance of the imperial function in Italy. Scholars of the time saw in it a clear rupture, foundational for medieval history. In the modern era, this interpretation has been perpetuated, even reinforced. European school textbooks often presented 476 as the inevitable moment when Rome, torn by internal conflicts and invasions, collapsed to give way to feudal Europe. However, nuances exist. Some specialists insist on the continuity of Roman culture, law, and the Latin language through the barbarian kingdoms that succeeded it. The debate remains open, but the date 476 remains emblematic of a significant break in Western history. The most notable consequence of the deposition of Romulus Augustulus is the end of the tradition that wanted an Augustus to reign over Italy in the name of the Roman Empire. From now on, there is only one emperor, the one from the East, based in Constantinople. This accelerates the transformation of the Western world into a mosaic of independent kingdoms, divided according to the power lines established by the Germanic military leaders. The legal and political unity, already largely weakened in the first half of the 5th century, gives way to regional political constructions, each inheriting parts of Roman culture and organization while introducing its own particularities. Moreover, the disappearance of a central power in Rome highlights the major institutional changes that emerge with the reigns of leaders like Odoacer and later Theodoric the Great, Ostrogoth king, in Italy. These rulers adopt certain attributes or practices of the Roman Empire, while establishing themselves durably on Italian soil, presenting themselves as protectors of peace and prosperity. The partial fusion of Romanity with new regional elites gradually undermines the concept of a unified Roman state, even as the Eastern Empire maintains its own legitimacy. If the Western Empire disappears as a sovereign entity, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, persists and considers itself the sole legitimate heir of Romanity. After 476, Emperor Zeno and then his successor Anastasius adopt a cautious stance toward the West. They observe the emergence of new barbarian kingdoms while remaining concerned about defending their eastern borders against powers like the Sassanid Persians or the Hunnic threat, which, although diminished, can still re-emerge. The ambitions of reconquest only materialize under Justinian in the 6th century during the famous Gothic Wars. Until then, the priority of the Eastern Empire lies elsewhere, maintaining internal stability, ensuring the security of trade routes, and resisting pressures at its gates. It is only once these issues are partially resolved that Justinian will contemplate submitting or at least restoring imperial authority over Italy, North Africa, and, to a lesser extent, the former Roman territories of the West. As the centuries advance, the role of the Church will amplify. It manages almsgiving, education, and a large part of local justice. In regions lacking strong civil powers, the bishop becomes an essential figure, if not the only stable authority for populations. The ties woven between Rome and the various local churches gradually consolidate a network of solidarities that transcend the borders of the new kingdoms. This is a true transformation. The Roman unity, now politically broken, finds a sort of moral and cultural cement in the Christian religion. When one evokes the end of the Western Roman Empire, the name Romulus Augustulus resonates with an almost tragic irony. Romulus, the first king, is said to have founded Rome in blood and the will of the gods. Romulus Augustulus, a fragile and powerless adolescent, embodies its final breath. One built the legend, the other closes the book. Between the two, over 1,000 years of conquests, glory, grandeur, and decadence. Thus, the history of Rome opens and closes on the same name, as if destiny wanted to inscribe, in this perfect loop, the fatality of empires and the twilight of civilizations.